Tarek Voss crouched low behind a twisted column of stone, its jagged edges still radiating heat from the orbital bombardment. Smoke hung thick in the air, smothering the light of the shattered dome above. The ruined chamber had been a neutral zone, or so the Exarch's emissaries had sworn. Now, it was nothing more than a death trap. "Tarek," whispered a voice behind him, low and urgent. It was Elias Quor, his lean frame silhouetted against the eerie green glow of smoldering debris. The AI engineer clutched a small device to his chest, its surface flickering with alien symbols. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they tighten the perimeter." Tarek glanced toward the far end of the chamber, where the bodies of his delegation lay strewn like discarded puppets. The Exarch's troops had cut them down without hesitation, their precision fire leaving no room for survival. He clenched his jaw, the metallic tang of blood sharp on his tongue. "We're not leaving without the others," he said, his voice like tempered steel. "There are no others," Elias replied, a trace of bitterness in his tone. This is all that's left." The faint echoes of footsteps punctured the suffocating silence, the unmistakable rhythm of armored boots against shattered stone. Tarek's heart raced, but his mind remained sharp. He touched the comm implant behind his ear. "Kael, status." "Extraction point is compromised," came Kael Zoran's gruff response. The strategist's words crackled with static, undercutting his usual calm. "We've got 3 frigates moving into low orbit, and Velaroth's ground forces are deploying artillery. If you're coming out, do it now." Tarek inhaled deeply, forcing the thickened air into his lungs. He had been a diplomat for over a decade, navigating impossible negotiations with worlds far more alien than this one. But diplomacy had failed today, as it always seemed to with Velaroth. The tyrant didn't bargain, he consumed. This meeting had been a gamble, one they had lost in spectacular fashion. He signaled Elias to stay close and moved quickly through the rubble, his boots crunching over shards of molten metal. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from the weight of his body, but from the choices he now carried. There had been no chance for dialogue, no opportunity to sway the Exarch's mind. The galaxy's most feared despot had made his intentions clear. Humanity would kneel or burn. Ahead, the chamber's jagged exit yawned like a predator's maw, offering both hope and peril. Tarek slowed, motioning for Elias to take cover behind a fallen beam. He surveyed the path forward, the faint shimmer of energy shields betraying the positions of the Exarch's soldiers. They were thorough, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. "You're thinking about something stupid, aren't you?" Elias murmured. "Always," Tarek replied with a fleeting smirk, "but it's the kind of stupid that keeps us alive." A blinding flash erupted from the far side of the chamber as a detonation split the air. The shockwave rippled through the ruins, rattling loose fragments from the dome above. Tarek seized the moment, darting forward with Elias close behind. The soldiers' attention snapped to the explosion, their formation faltering as confusion set in. Tarek dove behind an upturned slab of marble, his breathing ragged but controlled. The scent of charred stone and overheated circuits filled his nostrils, a reminder of how close they were to annihilation. Elias slid in beside him, clutching the device as though it were a lifeline. "Did you do that?" Elias asked, eyes wide. Tarek shook his head. "Kael's handiwork. He's got a flair for the dramatic." A voice boomed across the chamber, cold and commanding. "Surrender now, and you may yet live to see your precious Earth crumble." Tarek recognized that voice. It belonged to Velaroth's second-in-command, Commander Thalik, a man whose cruelty was rivaled only by his efficiency. Tarek exhaled slowly, forcing the weight of fear from his chest. "Thalik," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You've made your point, but tell me, how will your master react when he learns you failed to bring me back alive?" A pause, then laughter, low and guttural. "You mistake survival for victory, human. But if you're so eager to test your luck, I'll oblige." The sound of weapons charging echoed through the ruins, a mechanical symphony that left no doubt about their intent. Tarek tightened his grip on the sidearm strapped to his thigh. He wasn't a soldier, but survival had taught him the basics. He glanced at Elias, who nodded, his determination outweighing his fear. "Now," Tarek whispered. Elias activated the device, sending a pulse of energy cascading through the chamber. The soldiers' energy shields flickered and died, their precision instruments momentarily disrupted. Tarek surged forward, firing precise shots that struck the disoriented troops. Elias followed, using the device to scramble their communications. The pair moved as one, their desperation driving them through the chaos. Tarek's mind raced with calculations, routes, timing, probabilities, all filtered through the singular goal of survival. The exit loomed closer, its jagged edges lit by the harsh glow of searchlights outside. As they burst into the open, the frigid night air bit at Tarek's skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat within. Above them the sky was a tapestry of stars, interrupted by the menacing silhouettes of Velaroth's frigates. The low hum of engines, no, the tremor of distant energy fields, reverberated through the ground, a reminder of the power arrayed against them. Kael's voice crackled through the calm. "I see you. Hold position for 10 seconds." Tarek crouched behind a fallen column, scanning the perimeter. The enemy was regrouping, their movements swift and precise. He could feel Elias trembling beside him, the weight of their survival pressing down like a physical force. A sudden roar filled the air as a sleek resistance dropship descended, its hull glinting in the harsh light of the frigates above. The hatch opened, revealing Kael's broad-shouldered frame. "Move!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. Tarek didn't need to be told twice. He hauled Elias to his feet, the two of them sprinting for the dropship as plasma fire erupted around them. The heat of the bolts seared the air, the acrid scent of scorched earth filling Tarek's lungs. They leapt aboard just as the dropship's engines roared to life, propelling them skyward. Tarek collapsed against the bulkhead, his chest heaving with exertion. Across from him, Kael leaned against a console, his expression unreadable. "What the hell happened down there?" Kael asked, his tone sharp. Tarek met his gaze, the weight of the day's events settling over him. "Diplomacy failed," he said simply. "Now, we fight." Kael's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Then we'll make them regret underestimating us." As the dropship climbed higher, the shattered colony fell away, replaced by the vast expanse of stars. Tarek stared out the viewport, his mind already racing with plans. The Exarch had lit a fire, but it would be humanity that turned it into an inferno. The dropship's cabin thrummed with tension as it hurtled through the cold vastness of space. Tarek Voss stared out of the narrow viewport, his reflection ghosting across the endless sea of stars. The fiery glow of the ruined colony still lingered in the distance, its embers scattered like a dying constellation. The sight burned into his mind, a vivid reminder of the price humanity had already paid. A pause, then laughter, low and guttural. "You mistake survival for victory, human. But if you're so eager to test your luck, I'll oblige." The sound of weapons charging echoed through the ruins, a mechanical symphony that left no doubt about their intent. Tarek tightened his grip on the sidearm strapped to his thigh. He wasn't a soldier, but survival had taught him the basics. He glanced at Elias, who nodded, his determination outweighing his fear. "Now," Tarek whispered. Elias activated the device, sending a pulse of energy cascading through the chamber. The soldiers' energy shields flickered and died, their precision instruments momentarily disrupted. Tarek surged forward, firing precise shots that struck the disoriented troops. Elias followed, using the device to scramble their communications. The pair moved as one, their desperation driving them through the chaos. Tarek's mind raced with calculations, routes, timing, probabilities, all filtered through the singular goal of survival. The exit loomed closer, its jagged edges lit by the harsh glow of searchlights outside. As they burst into the open, the frigid night air bit at Tarek's skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat within. Above them the sky was a tapestry of stars, interrupted by the menacing silhouettes of Velaroth's frigates. The low hum of engines, no, the tremor of distant energy fields, reverberated through the ground, a reminder of the power arrayed against them. Kael's voice crackled through the calm. "I see you. Hold position for 10 seconds." Tarek crouched behind a fallen column, scanning the perimeter. The enemy was regrouping, their movements swift and precise. He could feel Elias trembling beside him, the weight of their survival pressing down like a physical force. A sudden roar filled the air as a sleek resistance dropship descended, its hull glinting in the harsh light of the frigates above. The hatch opened, revealing Kael's broad-shouldered frame. "Move!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. Tarek didn't need to be told twice. He hauled Elias to his feet, the two of them sprinting for the dropship as plasma fire erupted around them. The heat of the bolts seared the air, the acrid scent of scorched earth filling Tarek's lungs. They leapt aboard just as the dropship's engines roared to life, propelling them skyward. Tarek collapsed against the bulkhead, his chest heaving with exertion. Across from him, Kael leaned against a console, his expression unreadable. "What the hell happened down there?" Kael asked, his tone sharp. Tarek met his gaze, the weight of the day's events settling over him. "Diplomacy failed," he said simply. "Now, we fight." Kael's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Then we'll make them regret underestimating us." As the dropship climbed higher, the shattered colony fell away, replaced by the vast expanse of stars. Tarek stared out the viewport, his mind already racing with plans. The Exarch had lit a fire, but it would be humanity that turned it into an inferno. The dropship's cabin thrummed with tension as it hurtled through the cold vastness of space. Tarek Voss stared out of the narrow viewport, his reflection ghosting across the endless sea of stars. The fiery glow of the ruined colony still lingered in the distance, its embers scattered like a dying constellation. The sight burned into his mind, a vivid reminder of the price humanity had already paid. Kael Zoran's voice broke the silence. "We need a plan, Tarek, not just another suicide mission." Tarek turned to face him, the strategist's sharp, chiseled features illuminated by the dim emergency lights. Kael's tone was steady, but there was an edge to it, a restrained anger simmering beneath the surface. He had seen too many missions fail, too many lives extinguished by Velaroth's unrelenting march. "A plan?" Tarek replied, his voice colder than he intended. "We had a plan. Diplomacy, negotiations, appeals to reason. Velaroth answered with slaughter." Kael leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on Tarek. "And now? What's your next move? We're down to scraps, people, ships, resources. Even with the Black Fleet, we're barely holding on." The air in the cabin felt heavier, thick with unspoken truths. Elias Quor, seated on a worn metal bench nearby, adjusted the device he'd salvaged from the ruins. The soft glow of its interface cast fleeting shadows across his gaunt face. "What we need is unity," Elias murmured, his voice low but certain. "Scattered resistance cells aren't enough. We need a single front." "And what do you propose?" Kael asked, his skepticism evident. "You think Velaroth's going to give us time to organize a rebellion?" Tarek straightened, the faint ache of exhaustion creeping into his shoulders. "Velaroth's strength is built on fear. Fear of his fleet, his soldiers, his power. But fear only works when people feel isolated. If we bring them together, if we show them he can bleed, we have a chance." Kael exhaled sharply, a sound halfway between frustration and grudging acknowledgement. "You want to ignite a galaxy-wide rebellion? That's ambitious, even for you." "It's our only option," Tarek said, his voice firm. "The colonies are desperate, Kael. They'll fight if they see hope." The dropship shuddered as it entered the hangar bay of a larger ship. The Black Fleet's flagship, Resolute, loomed around them, its cavernous interior alive with activity. The sharp tang of heated metal filled the air as sparks rained down from welding torches, engineers racing to repair battered hulls and retrofit scavenged weapons. The rhythmic clatter of boots echoed through the space as soldiers marched to and from their assignments, their faces set in grim determination. Elias followed Tarek down the ramp, his hand still cradling the device. "This might be the key," he said, nodding toward it. "The rage weapon. If we can stabilize it, control it, it could change everything." Tarek's eyes narrowed as he regarded the device. "Or it could destroy us," he said quietly. "We need to understand it before we rely on it." The command deck of the Resolute was a stark contrast to the chaos of the hangar. Its polished surfaces gleamed under soft white lights, and holographic displays projected tactical maps of the surrounding systems. The air was cool, sterile, carrying a faint hum of machinery. Kael stepped forward, gesturing to the central display. These are the colonies still holding out against Velaroth. Most are barely functional, cut off from supply lines, surrounded by hostile forces. If we can coordinate their defenses, we might stand a chance. Tarek studied the map, his mind racing. The colonies were scattered across vast distances, each one a beacon of resistance surrounded by darkness. Uniting them would be a monumental task, but it was a task worth undertaking. "Start with the closest," Tarek said, his tone decisive. "Send out encrypted signals, let them know they're not alone." Kael frowned. "That'll draw attention. Velaroth won't ignore a coordinated effort." "Good," Tarek replied. "Let him come. He thinks we're weak, disorganized. Let him underestimate us." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their mission settling over them. Elias broke it, his voice laced with quiet conviction. "This is bigger than survival. If we win, we're not just saving ourselves. We're proving that tyranny can be challenged." Kael's lips twisted into a wry smile. "Let's hope the galaxy's listening." The first test of their unity came sooner than expected. A colony on the edge of Velaroth's territory, Maryland IV, sent out a distress signal just hours after receiving the Resolute's transmission. The message crackled over the comms, the voice of its governor frantic but defiant. "Velaroth's forces are closing in. We'll fight to the last, but we can't hold without reinforcements." Tarek's response was immediate. "Prepare the fleet. We move now." The journey to Maryland IV was a tense one. The Black Fleet's ships, though formidable, were heavily outnumbered by Velaroth's forces. The soldiers aboard the Resolute moved with quiet efficiency, their faces grim but resolute. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, every sound sharper. As the fleet dropped out of warp, the battlefield came into view. Maryland IV's surface was scarred with craters, its skies alive with streaks of energy fire. Velaroth's ships loomed like predators, their sleek designs radiating menace. The colony's defenders, though valiant, were clearly overwhelmed. Tarek stood on the command deck, his gaze fixed on the scene. "Deploy the fleet. Focus fire on their lead ships. Draw their attention away from the colony." The Resolute surged forward, its weapons blazing as it engaged the enemy. The battle was chaos, ships weaving through fiery debris, explosions tearing through the void. The Resolute shook violently as enemy fire raked its shields, the vibrations rattling through the deck. "Shields at 50%, a technician called out. "Hold the line," Tarek ordered. "We're not leaving until Maryland IV is secure." Elias worked feverishly at a nearby console, his fingers flying over the controls. "I've integrated the rage weapon into the fleet's systems," he said. "It's untested, but—" "No choice," Tarek interrupted. "Do it." The weapon activated with a shudder that seemed to resonate through every ship. A surge of energy rippled outward, a visible wave that distorted the stars around it. The enemy ships faltered, their systems overloaded, their formations breaking apart. The tide of battle shifted. The Black Fleet pressed the advantage, their ships driving Velaroth's forces back. The colony's defenders rallied, their desperation transformed into fierce determination. As the last of Velaroth's ships fled, the battlefield fell silent. The victory was hard won, but it was a victory nonetheless. Tarek stood amidst the aftermath, the weight of the moment sinking in. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly, his gaze distant. "But today we've shown the galaxy what humanity can do." Kael approached, his expression a mix of relief and caution. "We bought ourselves time, but Velaroth won't take this lightly." "Let him come," Tarek said, his voice firm. "We're ready." The dimly lit war room aboard the Resolute felt claustrophobic, the air thick with tension. Tactical holomaps flickered on the central table, casting fractured light across grim faces. Tarek Voss stood at the head of the room, his hands braced against the edge of the console. Every pair of eyes in the room was on him, waiting for direction. "Maryland IV was a victory," Tarek began, his voice even, though the strain was evident in his eyes. But it was a small one. Velaroth will not let us strike twice without retaliation. Kael Zorn, his towering presence unmistakable, leaned against the wall with arms crossed. We crippled one of his fleets. He's already regrouping, Tarek. Reports from the scouts indicate his forces are mobilizing near the Tiris Nebula. Elias Quor, seated with the Rage Weapons portable interface before him, interjected. And there's another problem. The weapon's energy signature wasn't just detectable, it's drawing attention. Velaroth's forces aren't the only ones who noticed. We intercepted faint transmissions from an unknown source near the nebula. Tarek frowned, his gaze shifting to the map as he processed the new information. Unaligned factions? Possibly, Elias replied. Or worse, scavengers. Opportunists looking to exploit a battlefield. Then we have two fronts to worry about, Kael said, his tone clipped. We need a strategy before this spirals out of control. Tarek pushed away from the console, pacing the room. The metallic floor resonated faintly beneath his boots, each step echoing his spiraling thoughts. We don't just hold ground, we draw Velaroth in. If he wants the rage weapon so badly, we let him think he can take it. Elias looked up sharply. You want to use it as bait? Kael smirked, a grim satisfaction flickering in his expression. Risky, but it could work if we control the field. Tarek nodded. We'll position the fleet near the nebula, but not directly in his path. Make it look like we're stretched thin. When his forces commit, we spring the trap. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the gamble sinking in. Elias finally broke the stillness. The energy output needs to stay below a threshold, or we risk... He hesitated, glancing down at the device. Other complications. Handle it, Tarek said firmly. We can't afford a mistake. Elias nodded, but his unease was palpable. The room dispersed, leaving Tarek to stare at the map's flickering lights. Every choice carried a cost, and he could feel the weight of those costs growing heavier with each passing hour. The Resolute's fleet moved swiftly toward the Tiris Nebula, its imposing silhouette slicing through the velvet darkness of space. As the ships approached the nebula, the viewports revealed a breathtaking display, swirling clouds of incandescent blue and violet, illuminated by bursts of distant starlight. The sight was both beautiful and foreboding, a natural labyrinth of shifting energy currents and concealed dangers. Tarek stood on the bridge, the faint hum of the ship's systems a backdrop to the tension in the room. Kael stood beside him, arms folded as he studied the tactical display. Velaroth's fleet will have to come through the nebula to reach us. The interference will disrupt their targeting systems, but it'll do the same to ours. We'll be ready, Tarek replied, his tone unwavering. Deploy scout ships at the edges of the nebula. I want to know the moment they enter. Elias appeared at the edge of the bridge, his movements deliberate. The weapon's ready. Output is stable for now, but prolonged use could destabilize the core. Tarek's gaze sharpened. How long? 30 minutes, maybe less. After that? Elias hesitated. It's unpredictable. Tarek nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we'll make those minutes count. As the fleet positioned itself within the nebula's veil, the waiting began. Hours passed in uneasy stillness, the tension mounting with every passing moment. The nebula's electromagnetic distortions played tricks on the ship's sensors, creating fleeting shadows that set the crew on edge. Contact! A technician called out, breaking the quiet. Velaroth's fleet entering the nebula, 15 ships at least. Kael stepped forward, his voice steady. Tarek, they're committing. What's the play? Tarek's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. Hold formation. Let them get closer. The minutes stretched painfully, the enemy fleet advancing through the nebula like wolves closing in on prey. When they were finally within range, Tarek gave the order. Engage! The Resolute roared to life, its weapon systems lighting up the void. The fleet's coordinated assault caught the enemy off guard, their ships scrambling to adapt to the sudden onslaught. The nebula's interference turned the battle into a chaotic brawl, with ships darting through dense energy currents and bursts of plasma illuminating the darkness. Tarek moved through the chaos of the bridge, issuing orders with precision. Focus fire on their lead ships. Break their formation. The Resolute shuddered under enemy fire, the vibrations rattling through the deck. Sparks erupted from a nearby console, the acrid scent of burning circuits filling the air. The crew worked frantically to stabilize the systems, their movements a blur of urgency. Elias's voice cut through the din. "Weapon ready to fire on your command." Tarek hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. "Do it." The rage weapon activated, its energy pulse rippling outward like a tidal wave. The enemy ships faltered, their systems overloaded by the sudden surge. The fleet pressed the advantage, their weapons tearing through the disoriented enemy. But the victory was short-lived. A new signature appeared on the sensors, unknown ships emerging from the far side of the nebula. Their sleek, predatory designs were unlike anything Tarek had seen before, their movements precise and deliberate. "Who the hell are they?" Kael muttered, his gaze fixed on the display. Elias's face paled as he analyzed the readings. "Not scavengers. These ships, they're ancient. Their systems are drawing power directly from the nebula's currents." Tarek's heart sank as realization dawned. The intercepted transmissions, the strange energy signatures. It wasn't just Velaroth who had been drawn here. Something older, something far more dangerous, had been awakened. "Prepare to withdraw," Tarek ordered, his voice firm despite the unease clawing at him. "We've done enough damage for one day." As the fleet began its retreat, the unknown ships watched, their silence more unnerving than any attack. Tarek stared at the display, his mind racing with questions. Who were these new players, and what did they want? The nebula faded into the distance as the Resolute slipped into the relative safety of warp space. But the mystery lingered, a shadow that refused to dissipate. Tarek turned to Kael, his expression grim. "We need answers, before it's too late." The Resolute glided through the shadowed expanse of warp space, the ethereal glow of its fields flickering across the walls of the observation deck where Tarek Voss stood. The tension was palpable, coiling around him like a living thing. His reflection stared back from the viewport, the stars blurred into streaks of light by their relentless passage. Kael Zoran entered, his heavy boots muted on the polished floor. He carried a tablet displaying real-time data, its glow casting sharp lines across his weathered face. "They're tracking us," he said without preamble. "Not Velaroth's ships, the others. Those things from the nebula." Tarek didn't look away from the swirling void beyond. "How far?" "Not far enough," Kael replied grimly. "They're maintaining formation. No hails. No signs of aggression yet. They're just watching." Tarek's jaw tightened. Like predators waiting for their prey to tire. Kael set the tablet on the nearby console and folded his arms. "We can't outrun them forever. If they're this advanced, they're reading every move we make. What's the play here?" Tarek turned to face him, his voice a quiet steel. "We make them come to us. If they want something, they'll show their hand." "And if what they want is to finish what Velaroth started?" Kael asked. "Then we make them regret underestimating us," Tarek said simply. Elias Quar's voice crackled over the comm system, cutting through the charged air. "Tarek, you need to see this. Come to the lab." Moments later, Tarek and Kael stepped into the lab, the sterile space filled with the faint hum of machinery. Elias was hunched over the rage weapon's interface, his hands moving swiftly across its controls. Holographic projections danced in the air around him, displaying complex energy patterns. "What is it?" Tarek asked, his eyes narrowing at the swirling symbols. Elias looked up, his face pale and drawn. "The ships from the nebula. They're not just following us. They're scanning the weapon. Every time it activates, it's like a beacon to them." Kael's expression darkened. "So they're not here for us. They're here for that thing." "That's part of it," Elias said, his voice heavy with unease. "But it's more than that. The energy signature the weapon emits, it matches something in their database. It's like they recognize it." "Recognize it?" Tarek repeated, his tone sharp. "Explain." Elias gestured to the holograms. "The weapon's core isn't just a human invention. It's built around an artifact, a piece of something much older, something they know." The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Tarek stared at the projections, his mind racing. "You're telling me we've been carrying an alien relic into every battle?" Elias nodded. "And it's why they're here. They want it back." Kael exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "And Velaroth? Does he know?" "If he does, it changes everything," Tarek said. "If Velaroth realizes what he's fighting for, this war won't just be about humanity. It'll be about who controls whatever this artifact is." Silence fell as the implications sunk in. Then Tarek straightened, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to get ahead of this. If they want the weapon, we need to know why." "How?" Elias asked. "We can't exactly ask them to tea." Tarek's gaze was steady. "We give them what they want." Kael frowned. "You want to hand over our most powerful weapon? Are you out of your mind?" "Not the weapon," Tarek said. "The artifact. If it's the key to all of this, we need answers, and they're the only ones who have them." Kael rubbed a hand across his face, his frustration simmering. "And what happens when they decide to take it and wipe us out anyway?" "Then we fight," Tarek said simply. "But right now, ignorance is more dangerous than any enemy." The decision made, the Resolute dropped out of warp near a desolate system, its star a dim red ember. The alien ships followed, their sleek forms cutting through the darkness with predatory grace. Tarek stood on the bridge, his presence commanding, as he watched them close in. "Send the signal," he ordered. Elias worked at his console, transmitting a carefully calibrated burst of energy from the weapon. The response was immediate. One of the alien ships broke formation, gliding forward with eerie precision. Its hull shimmered with a faint bioluminescence, the light shifting in intricate patterns. "They're responding," Elias said, his voice tight with tension. "At least, I think they are." The alien ship halted a short distance from the Resolute, its imposing form dwarfing the human vessel. A moment later, a beam of light lanced out, scanning the weapon's interface. Tarek stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know you're listening. If you want the artifact, talk to us." For a moment, nothing happened. Then a voice filled the bridge, smooth and resonant, each word deliberate. "You carry what is not yours. It must be returned." Tarek met Kael's wary glance, but kept his focus forward. "What is it? What does it do?" The voice paused, as if considering the question. "It is a fragment of the vault, a remnant of what was sealed long ago." "And if we don't return it?" Tarek asked. The voice grew colder. "Then you invite destruction, not only upon yourselves, but upon all who share your skies." Kael stepped closer, his voice low. "Tarek, this is insane. We don't even know if they're telling the truth." "We can't afford not to," Tarek said. He turned back to the projection. "We'll give it to you, but only if you tell us what we're dealing with." The alien's response was immediate. "Agreed." The artifact was carefully extracted from the weapon, its crystalline surface glinting with an inner light. It was placed in a containment pod, which was sent toward the alien ship. The tension on the bridge was suffocating as they waited for a response. The alien ship withdrew, its lights dimming as it vanished into the void. Tarek exhaled, the knot in his chest loosening slightly, but the sense of relief was fleeting. "We've bought time," he said quietly, "but now we're playing a game we don't understand." Kael crossed his arms, his expression grim. "And Velaroth? If he figures out what's missing?" "He won't," Tarek said. "Not if we keep moving." But even as he spoke, a shadow of doubt lingered in his mind. The galaxy had just become far more dangerous, and humanity was still on the edge of annihilation. The Resolute drifted in the shadow of a dying star, its crimson glow casting long, ghostly shadows across the bridge. Tarek Voss leaned over the command console, his fingers tapping out a rhythmic beat against the cold metal as he studied the tactical readouts. A hushed tension filled the air, every creak and vibration of the ship amplified in the silence. The artifact was gone, but its absence felt heavier than its presence ever had. Kael Zoran approached, his boots echoing faintly against the polished floor. "The fleet's holding formation, barely. That stunt with the artifact didn't win us any friends." Tarek didn't look up. "It wasn't meant to. It was meant to keep us alive. Kael folded his arms, his shadow stretching like a specter across the deck. For now, Velaroth's still out there, regrouping, and those watchers, whoever they are, don't exactly inspire confidence. We'll deal with Velaroth when he shows his face, Tarek replied, his tone sharp. Right now we need to understand what we're up against. Kael frowned. And how do you propose we do that? Ask nicely? Before Tarek could respond, Elias Quar's voice crackled over the intercom. Tarek, I've got something. Laboratory now. The urgency in Elias's tone set Tarek on edge. He exchanged a glance with Kael before heading for the lab, his strides purposeful. The metallic tang of recycled air filled his nostrils as he entered the confined space, the overhead lights casting a sterile glow. Elias stood amidst a swirl of holographic displays, his face a canvas of worry and excitement. Tell me it's good news, Tarek said, though he already suspected otherwise. Elias gestured to the projections, a chaotic tangle of energy readings and ancient schematics. Depends on your definition of good. When the artifact left, it triggered something. These are long-range scans from our sensor network. He pointed to a section of the display where faint but distinct signals pulsed in rhythmic patterns. They're waking up. Tarek frowned, his eyes narrowing. Who's waking up? Not who, Elias corrected. What? The vaults, or whatever the Watchers called them. There are more of them, scattered across the galaxy. And now that the artifact's been returned, they're activating. Kael leaned over the display, his expression darkening. Activating to do what? Elias hesitated, his gaze flickering to Tarek. That's the problem. The energy signatures, they're off the charts. If these things are weapons, we're talking planetary scale. Worse. Tarek's stomach nodded. And Velaroth? If he gets his hands on one. Elias trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Kael straightened, his jaw clenched. So now we're in a race. Us against Velaroth. And maybe those Watchers. Tarek nodded, his mind already racing. We need to find the nearest vault, figure out what's inside before anyone else does. Elias tapped a few keys, and the hologram shifted, displaying a star map. There's a signal coming from a system in the far reach. It's faint, but it matches the artifact's energy signature. If it's a vault, it might give us some answers. Or kill us all, Kael muttered. Tarek ignored him, his gaze fixed on the map. Set a course. We don't have time to waste. The journey to the far reach was fraught with unease. The Resolute and its escort ships traveled in silence, their crews on edge. Tarek spent the hours poring over every scrap of data Elias could provide, but the more he learned, the less sense it all made. The vaults were ancient, their origins predating even the oldest galactic civilizations. Whatever they were built for, it wasn't peace. When they finally arrived, the sight before them was breathtaking. The vault lay embedded in the surface of a barren planet, its structure a monolithic tower of obsidian and glass that shimmered with an unnatural light. Surrounding it were jagged canyons carved as though by the hand of a vengeful god. The planet's thin atmosphere painted the horizon in shades of violet and gold, its silence oppressive. The landing team consisted of Tarek, Kael, and Elias, along with a handful of soldiers armed to the teeth. The air outside was cold and biting, with every breath leaving frost on their visors. As they approached the vault's entrance, a low vibration resonated through the ground, a sensation that seemed to seep into their very bones. This place feels alive, Kael muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. It probably is, Elias replied, his voice tinged with awe. The energy readings are impossible. The entrance to the vault was a massive archway, its surface inscribed with symbols that shifted and twisted as though defying the laws of physics. Tarek hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he pushed forward, stepping into the shadowed corridor beyond. The interior was a labyrinth of metallic walls and glowing conduits, the air thick with an electric charge. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound warped and stretched. The deeper they ventured, the more the sense of unease grew. Elias stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on a console that jutted from the wall. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling. "The core interface." Tarek approached cautiously, his fingers brushing against the console's surface. It was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his touch. "Can you access it?" Elias nodded, already pulling out his tools. "Give me a minute." As Elias worked, the air seemed to grow heavier, each breath a labor. Kael shifted uneasily, his gaze darting to the shadows that seemed to writhe at the edges of their lights. "This place is wrong," he said quietly. "We shouldn't be here." "We don't have a choice," Tarek replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Kael was right. The console flared to life, a cascade of symbols and images flooding the space around them. Elias's fingers flew across the controls, his expression a mix of fascination and dread. "This isn't just a weapon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a failsafe, a containment system." "For what?" Tarek demanded. Elias's face paled. "For them, the Watchers. They're not just protecting these vaults, they're guarding what's inside." Kael stepped forward, his voice sharp. "And what's inside?" Elias hesitated, his gaze meeting Tarek's. Something they were afraid of. Something that could end everything. The room shuddered violently, a deep, guttural sound reverberating through the walls. The shadows twisted and writhed, and a low, otherworldly voice filled the air. "You should not have come." Tarek's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. They hadn't just found answers. They had woken something far worse. The low, guttural voice rippled through the vault like a predator's growl, resonating in the walls and vibrating through their bodies. Tarek Voss instinctively reached for his sidearm, though he knew it was a futile gesture. The air had shifted, thickening with a presence that seemed to press against their skin, making every breath feel heavier. Elias Quor froze at the console, his fingers hovering above the controls. His eyes darted to the pulsing symbols dancing across the screen, their patterns now erratic, almost panicked. "It's not just a voice," Elias said, his voice trembling. "It's the vault itself. It's alive. Alive and angry," Kael Zoran muttered, his rifle sweeping the shadows as the room darkened around them. The light from the conduits flickered, casting jagged, shifting shapes that seemed to lunge toward them. The voice spoke again, each word dragging like the grind of stone. "You are children playing with fire. This place is not for you." Tarek stepped forward, his tone steady despite the tension in his frame. "Who are you? What is this place?" The shadows pulsed, coalescing into a shape that loomed at the edge of the room. Its form was indistinct, shifting between solidity and smoke, its presence more felt than seen. When it spoke again, its voice was layered, as if 1,000 echoes followed each word. "This place is a prison, and you have weakened the chains." Elias's hands flew across the console as he whispered hurried calculations, the symbols twisting into incomprehensible shapes. "It's releasing energy, more than it's contained in millennia. The artifact we returned must have triggered some kind of destabilization." Kael took a step closer to Tarek, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here, now." The entity moved closer, its presence filling the room. "You have awakened the wrath of the forgotten. They will come, and they will unmake what you call existence." Tarek's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the oppressive air. "Then tell us how to stop it." The entity stilled, the room plunging into silence save for the faint thrum of energy. Finally it spoke, its voice dripping with disdain. "To stop it, you must become its warden, but the price will be your kind, your worlds, your lives." Kyle's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "Great! Another cryptic threat. We don't have time for riddles. Just tell us what we're dealing with." The entity turned toward Kael, its shadowed form expanding as though to envelop him. "You are dealing with the end," it intoned. "The forgotten were once creators, like the ones who built this prison. But they turned on the stars, consuming what they made. Your warlord Velaroth seeks their power, ignorant of its cost." Tarek processed the revelation, the weight of the words pressing on him like a physical force. "And the Watchers? Why haven't they destroyed the vaults?" "They guard what remains. the entity replied. But they are not infinite. They cannot stop the Forgotten if they awaken fully. You must decide, human. Flee and let the galaxy burn, or seal this place forever. Elias gasped as the console flared violently, sparks raining down as the symbols collapsed into static. The system is failing. We need to act now, or it won't matter what we choose. Tarek turned to the shadow, his voice unwavering. What do we need to do? The entity paused, then extended a tendril of shadow toward the console. The sparks dimmed as the symbols reformed, glowing with a fierce intensity. The core must be stabilized, but to do so, you must release the energy contained within. You will not survive. Kael's face hardened. There's no way we're letting this thing kill us without a fight. Tarek raised a hand, silencing Kael with a look. We don't have a choice, he said quietly. If this thing escapes, there won't be anything left to fight for. Elias's hands moved furiously across the controls, his expression a mix of terror and resolve. I can reroute the containment field to buy us time, but someone has to stay here and anchor the core. Tarek didn't hesitate. I'll do it. Kael rounded on him, his voice a low growl. Like hell you will. This is suicide, Tarek. It's necessity, Tarek replied, his tone firm. You and Elias need to get back to the Resolute. Warn the fleet. Prepare them for what's coming. Elias looked up, his voice breaking. Tarek, there has to be another way. There isn't, Tarek cut him off. You said it yourself. The artifact destabilized the vault. If we don't fix it now, Velaroth will have the galaxy handed to him on a silver platter. Kael grabbed Tarek by the arm, his grip iron. You've led us this far. We need you alive. Tarek met his gaze, a faint smile touching his lips. You'll manage without me. You always do. Before Kael could argue further, the vault shuddered violently, a low roar reverberating through its walls. Elias grabbed Kael's arm, pulling him toward the exit. We have to go, now! Kael cursed under his breath, but followed, his eyes lingering on Tarek until the shadows swallowed him. Tarek turned back to the console, the symbols now blindingly bright. He placed his hands on the controls, feeling the energy surge through him, burning like molten fire. The entity's voice whispered in his ear, soft and mocking. Brave, but bravery does not guarantee success. Tarek gritted his teeth, his focus unwavering. Neither does fear. The vault roared again, the sound deafening as the core flared to life. Tarek felt the energy coursing through him, tearing at his senses, but he held firm. The shadows writhed around him, their movements chaotic, desperate. The core's light grew brighter, engulfing the room in a searing brilliance. As the energy reached its peak, Tarek closed his eyes, his mind racing with memories of battles fought, lives lost, and the hope that drove him forward. He thought of the fleet, of Elias and Kael, of the billions of lives depending on this moment. And then there was silence. When Tarek opened his eyes, the vault was still. The shadows were gone, the air no longer heavy. The core pulsed faintly, its energy stabilized. He exhaled slowly, his body trembling but intact. The entity's voice returned, softer now, almost reverent. You have done what few could, but your fight is far from over. Tarek stepped back from the console, his breaths ragged. Then I'd better get to it. As he made his way back to the surface, the weight of what he'd learned pressed on him. The Forgotten were stirring, and Velaroth was moving closer. The battle ahead would be unlike any they'd faced, but for now, they had a chance. And Tarek would make sure it wasn't wasted. The air aboard the Resolute was electric with urgency. Tarek Voss had barely stepped back onto the bridge before Kael Zoran rounded on him, his face a mask of relief and simmering frustration. You're alive, Kael said sharply, though the tension in his voice betrayed a hint of gratitude. What the hell happened down there? Tarek's jaw tightened as he walked to the central console, activating a series of holomaps that spread across the room in glowing strands. The vault is stabilized, but the Forgotten are waking. Velaroth is moving faster than we anticipated. Kael crossed his arms. And we're supposed to stop both with what? A few battered ships and half a plane? Elias stepped into the room, his face pale but determined. "We have more than that," he interjected, holding a datapad. "The vault's systems didn't just stabilize, it transmitted. I've decrypted part of the signal. It's a warning, but also a map. It leads to the locations of the other vaults." Tarek turned, his brow furrowing. "Are they all prisons like this one?" "Most likely," Elias replied, "but some of the data suggests they were built with defenses. Weapons. If we can secure one before Velaroth, we could turn the tide." Kael leaned over the console, his eyes scanning the map. "And Velaroth?" "He's not going to wait for us to play scavenger hunt." Tarek nodded, his mind racing. "We don't have the luxury of time. Velaroth's fleet is massing near Galthar Prime. If he's heading to a vault, we need to intercept him before he reaches it." Kael raised an eyebrow. "Intercept him? You're talking about taking on his entire fleet." "No," Tarek replied. "I'm talking about splitting his fleet. We lure part of his forces away and hit him where it hurts. His command ship." Elias frowned. "And how do you plan to do that? Velaroth's no fool. He won't take the bait unless it's something he can't ignore." Tarek's gaze was steely. "We give him the rage weapon." Kael's face darkened, his voice rising. "You want to hand over our most powerful asset? Are you insane?" "No," Tarek said firmly. "We won't give him the real thing. We'll rig a decoy, a reactor core modified to mimic the weapon's energy signature. He'll think he's chasing the prize, but it'll lead him into our trap." Elias's eyes widened as he processed the plan. "We'd have to calibrate the decoy precisely. Velaroth's scanners are advanced. If he detects a flaw, the whole plan falls apart." "Then we don't leave room for flaws," Tarek said. "You'll handle the decoy. Kael, I need you to coordinate the diversion. Make it believable. Velaroth needs to think we're desperate." Kael let out a breath, his frustration giving way to grim acceptance. "And the trap?" Tarek gestured to the map. "We draw him to the Veltran belt. It's a graveyard of derelict ships, plenty of debris to use as cover. We'll position our fleet to ambush him when he takes the bait." "And what about his reinforcements?" Elias asked. "He won't come alone." Tarek's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll split them up. Once he commits to the decoy, the rest of his fleet will scatter to chase the remnants of ours. We need to make sure they're chasing ghosts." Kael's expression hardened. "It's a hell of a gamble." "It's all we've got," Tarek replied. "If we wait, he'll find the next vault, and this war will be over before we can stop it." And Tarek would make sure it wasn't wasted. The air aboard the Resolute was electric with urgency. Tarek Voss had barely stepped back onto the bridge before Kael Zoran rounded on him, his face a mask of relief and simmering frustration. "You're alive," Kael said sharply, though the tension in his voice betrayed a hint of gratitude. "What the hell happened down there?" Tarek's jaw tightened as he walked to the central console, activating a series of holomaps that spread across the room in glowing strands. "The vault is stabilized, but the Forgotten are waking. Velaroth is moving faster than we anticipated." Kael crossed his arms. "And we're supposed to stop both with what? A few battered ships and half a plane?" Elias stepped into the room, his face pale but determined. "We have more than that," he interjected, holding a datapad. "The vault's systems didn't just stabilize, it transmitted. I've decrypted part of the signal. It's a warning, but also a map. It leads to the locations of the other vaults." Tarek turned, his brow furrowing. "Are they all prisons like this one?" "Most likely," Elias replied, "but some of the data suggests they were built with defenses. Weapons. If we can secure one before Velaroth, we could turn the tide." Kael leaned over the console, his eyes scanning the map. "And Velaroth?" "He's not going to wait for us to play scavenger hunt." Tarek nodded, his mind racing. "We don't have the luxury of time. Velaroth's fleet is massing near Galthar Prime. If he's heading to a vault, we need to intercept him before he reaches it." Kael raised an eyebrow. "Intercept him? You're talking about taking on his entire fleet." "No," Tarek replied. "I'm talking about splitting his fleet. We lure part of his forces away and hit him where it hurts. His command ship." Elias frowned. "And how do you plan to do that? Velaroth's no fool. He won't take the bait unless it's something he can't ignore. Tarek's gaze was steely. We give him the rage weapon. Kael's face darkened, his voice rising. You want to hand over our most powerful asset? Are you insane? No, Tarek said firmly. We won't give him the real thing. We'll rig a decoy, a reactor core modified to mimic the weapon's energy signature. He'll think he's chasing the prize, but it'll lead him into our trap. Elias's eyes widened as he processed the plan. We'd have to calibrate the decoy precisely. Velaroth's scanners are advanced. If he detects a flaw, the whole plan falls apart. Then we don't leave room for flaws, Tarek said. You'll handle the decoy. Kael, I need you to coordinate the diversion. Make it believable. Velaroth needs to think we're desperate. Kael let out a breath, his frustration giving way to grim acceptance. And the trap? Tarek gestured to the map. We draw him to the Veltran belt. It's a graveyard of derelict ships, plenty of debris to use as cover. We'll position our fleet to ambush him when he takes the bait. And what about his reinforcements? Elias asked. He won't come alone. Tarek's lips pressed into a thin line. We'll split them up. Once he commits to the decoy, the rest of his fleet will scatter to chase the remnants of ours. We need to make sure they're chasing ghosts. Kael's expression hardened. It's a hell of a gamble. It's all we've got, Tarek replied. If we wait, he'll find the next vault, and this war will be over before we can stop it. Tarek's heart hammered in his chest. Velaroth was a tactician, ruthless and calculating. For him to resort to this meant the tyrant understood he was cornered. Kael, you need to stop him, whatever it takes. On the other end of the line, Tarek could hear the chaos, a mix of shouted commands, the dull roar of weapons fire, and the eerie calm of Velaroth's voice cutting through it all. You think you've won? The tyrant sneered. You think your defiance matters? Your kind is nothing. A fleeting moment in a galaxy that will forget you. Kael's voice was a growl. We'll see about that. Tarek turned to Elias, his voice sharp. Prepare the fleet for emergency retreat. If Kael can't stop him, we'll have to abandon this sector. Elias hesitated. If the decoy detonates while we're still in range, then we'll make sure we're not, Tarek snapped. Just get it done. Inside Velaroth's ship, Kael and his team fought with the desperation of cornered wolves. The control room was a battlefield, every surface scorched and splintered by the ferocity of the fight. Kael lunged toward the central console, narrowly avoiding a strike from one of Velaroth's guards. He fired a precise shot, dropping the soldier, before turning to face the tyrant. Velaroth stood at the console, his towering frame illuminated by the pulsing red lights of the reactor. His face was a mask of fury, but his eyes gleamed with a terrifying calm. You'll die here, like the rest of your pitiful race, he said, his voice low and venomous. Kael raised his rifle, his breathing labored. You've already lost, Velaroth. You just don't know it yet. Velaroth laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room. Lost? I have waged wars across 100 worlds, crushed empires under my heel. What are you? A scattered band of scavengers clinging to a dying hope. Kael didn't flinch. We're the ones who'll remind the galaxy what it means to fight back. The tyrant moved suddenly, his hand darting toward the console. Kael reacted instinctively, firing a shot that struck the panel, sending a cascade of sparks flying. Velaroth snarled, his composure cracking as Kael advanced. Back on the Resolute, Tarek watched the display with mounting tension. The signal from Kael's team was erratic, flickering in and out as interference from the reactor intensified. Kael, he called, his voice taut. What's happening? The reply came through faintly, laced with static. We've got him pinned, but the reactor, he's got it on a dead man's switch. If he goes, so does everything. Tarek's blood ran cold. He glanced at Elias, who met his gaze with grim understanding. There's no way to disarm it remotely, Elias said. If he's tied it to his biometrics, then someone has to stay, Tarek finished, his voice heavy. Kael's voice cut through the calm, clear despite the chaos. I'll handle it. Get the fleet out of here. Tarek froze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Kael, don't argue, Tarek, Kael said firmly. You know this is the only way. Get out while you can." For a moment Tarek couldn't speak. Then he nodded, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "You've got 3 minutes. Don't waste them." The Resolute began to retreat, its engines flaring as the fleet pulled away from the debris field. The battle was still raging, but the intensity had shifted, the focus narrowing to the final moments aboard Velaroth's ship. Kael stood before the reactor, his rifle trained on Velaroth. The tyrant sneered, his defiance unbroken. "Even if you stop me, you won't stop what's coming. The Forgotten will rise, and your pathetic resistance will be ashes." Kael's expression didn't waver. "Maybe, but at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing I took you down first." He fired, the shot precise and final. Velaroth fell, his grip on the switch releasing as Kael rushed to the console. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, overriding the failsafe and stabilizing the reactor just as the countdown reached its final seconds. On the bridge of the Resolute, Tarek watched the explosion bloom in the distance, a brilliant light that consumed Velaroth's ship and the surrounding wreckage. He closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the loss settling over him. Elias approached, his voice soft. "Kael?" Tarek opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "He did what he had to, and now it's up to us." The fleet drifted in silence, the stars a distant, indifferent audience. Tarek stood at the viewport, his reflection ghostly against the vast expanse. Velaroth was gone, but the war was far from over. The Forgotten were waking, and humanity's fight was only beginning. But for the first time, Tarek felt the stirrings of something new, a fragile, burning hope. They had faced the impossible and survived, and in doing so, they had reminded the galaxy of a simple truth. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or power. It was the refusal to surrender.